Hello and welcome to episode 7 of the Rain Check podcast discussing the monarchs of England. I'm Austin.
I'm Donna.
And this week we are talking about King Edgar the Peaceful. And apologies to everyone out there. I know you've been dying for a new episode to come out. We appreciate your patience, and we are sure that this episode will make up for the week we took off.
100%.
It's going to be a
Yes.
great episode.
Those who had to wait for this episode, Edgar didn't have to wait that long to become king because he became
Hmm.
king pretty early.
He was pretty early, and he definitely won out over his brother. So he was born in 943 to King Edmund the First and his wife Elfgifu of Shaftesbury. And as you know, his father Edmund was eventually murdered in a fight with a kidnapper
Thief,
and
yes.
a thief. Then in 9 years later, in 955, his uncle took over at that point, but then his uncle Edred dies. He had had a lot of stomach issues, so that's when Edgar's older brother, Edwy, what was his full name? We'll come back to
Edwig. Yeah, Edwig.
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 Edwig. He became king, as we heard in the last episode. And then only 2 years later, Edwy does such a poor job that the kingdom is divided in half, with the Mercians and the Northumbrians rejecting Edwy and accepting Edgar as their ruler north of the Thames.
And Edgar was only 14 at the time, so I suspect that his grandmother had something to do with this because remember his older brother Edwig had disinherited his mom, his grandmother, Edgifu, who was quite powerful. She had been we've heard about her for the last 5 episodes or so, and she's been very involved, and she kind of brought in Dunstan and all of this. And it's interesting that why would the Witten decide to make a 14-year-old king of Mercia and Northumbria? So I think it might have something to do with her working behind the scenes since Edwig had taken away her power.
That would make sense, yeah. So basically, Edwig was much more independent, you might say, than Edgar. So he did not want the elders, to really advise him or assist him or whatever you want to call it, and kind of banished most of them. Whereas then once Edgar is king, he's much more open to that. He's like a company man, or I don't know what you want to say, but he's has more loyalty towards his relatives.
Potentially, they told him, "Look, we'll make you king if you keep us close." I don't know.
True. Right, exactly. That would make a lot of sense. And again, we really don't know all the ins and outs, because especially if they're doing a sort of like deep state, almost like coup, they're not going to write about it in the history books. But you can kind of put the pieces together. Speaking of that, actually, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle has only 10 entries on his reign, and other sources dating to the late 10th and early 11th centuries, so a little bit later, are mainly interested in the Episcopal leaders of the English Benedictine Reform movement that Edgar heavily supported, but again, the monks are writing the history, and they, especially for this time, care a lot more about what was going on with the church leaders rather than the king. So we really don't know too much about him.
It's also interesting that he's called the Peaceful because I've read several sources that said he wasn't a very peaceable person.
Hmm.
He was apparently quite short, unusually short, even in that time when men were shorter,
Hmm.
and had a bit of a Napoleonic uh,
Complex.
complex, um, and was quick to anger. In fact, King Malcolm of Scotland, or maybe King Kenneth, the king in Scotland, was at a banquet in Scotland with a bunch of people, and he said some sort of jibe, made a comment about the Edgar's height or lack thereof.
Yeah.
And there was a chronicler, not a chronicler, but like a, a jouster, or one of the people that kind of traveled around to entertain and those sorts of things, was there. And when he eventually made his way to King Edgar, he shared what the joke had been. And so Edgar got the King of Scotland to come down on a pretext of them needing to do something together against an enemy, took him out to the woods, pulled out two swords, and said, "You get to show me how tough you think you really are,
Hmm.
and not be joking about me." And said they were going to fight to the death, but then the King of Scotland apologized to him, and
Oh, so
he
they didn't
got
even
off the
fight.
hook. They didn't even have a fight, but he wasn't that peaceful. But it just turned out that during the time of his reign, probably because of the things that had been put in place by his predecessors, there weren't any wars. And in part, maybe that's why there wasn't a lot for the Chronicle to write about, because there weren't any battles fought.
Yeah, my guess is they just sort of got lucky with it was a time when the Vikings weren't really attacking and the Normans haven't come yet. And maybe because there'd kind of been like a mini civil war, they were more focused on just keeping what they had, and he wasn't trying to take more land than they had already had, sort of thing. But that is interesting. I don't know. This is sort of a non sequitur, but I've just been watching a lot about late night TV, these documentaries, and it's sort of like how someone like David Letterman is really funny and seems kind of like chill and easy to hang out with, but apparently off camera, it's not like he was super just like a horrible person, but it was just like he was very self-critical and kind of depressed and mopey and never happy and kind of mean to people and especially executives and stuff. So anyway, just because your like role is some way doesn't mean that your like personality is that way. So, but he was seemingly very religious, or he was very supportive of this Benedictine reform movement. So all the other bishops and monks that were a part of that really liked Edgar. We'll get to,
Although there's rumors that he kidnapped a nun,
well,
and
yes,
yeah,
and that's his first wife, right?
right.
Yeah,
So I
so
don't know how religious it is to kidnap a nun, but
it's either the
but they
least
didn't care.
religious or most
Justin
religious.
doesn't care because she's just a female. Who cares about that?
Yeah. He was just so religious he needed to marry a nun.
That's a
No,
nice way of putting it, I
no, that's
guess.
definitely a point against him, yeah. So in 960, speaking of that, he appoints Dunstan, who we've heard about from, he was the guy that um, basically saw Ed, what's his name?
Edwin,
Former
Edwig,
Edwig, basically sleeping with that mom and daughter, and
right,
then
right.
Dunstan got banished, but then so he comes back, and this supports the idea that Dunstan might have worked to make this happen, is that Edgar appoints him as Archbishop of Canterbury, which is the top
The
position
top,
for the
yeah.
entire English church. And yeah, so that really starts a powerful alliance with the church. And then throughout the 960s, there's a lot of monastic reform, which was headed by Dunstan, Ethelwold, and Oswald, and it really made England very Benedictine from that point on.
It's also interesting. I listened to a whole podcast that was kind of about this and about how they're trying to do this Benedictine reforms based on Benedictine rules that were written in the fifth or sixth century in Rome for a
Mm,
very different setting.
hmm.
The rules had been written for like an individual monastery, and it was super specific about what time you're supposed to get up and what time you go to
Hmm.
bed, and all these really specific things that work when you're just dealing with one monastery, you know.
Hmm.
um, and now they wanted to apply it to every priest in the country, and so they had to really kind of come up with new interpretations of a very old, 400 or 500 year old rules that were made in a different country to try to make them fit.
So you're saying this reform was essentially them becoming more like Roman, like the way the Romans did
Well,
Christianity?
specifically, I mean, I don't know if all, I think Rome even had different, they had the Benedictine, and they maybe had the
Yeah, they had other.
Augustine, they
Yeah.
had others. But but what I got from it was that they took this thing that wasn't, it was kind of putting a round peg in a square hole, they like, or the opposite, however that saying is. Like they took
Yeah.
something
It'd be
that
like if
didn't
we
really
tried
fit.
to make American super Buddhist or something. It's just like you not
Right.
everything is going to carry over the same
Or
way.
even, I mean, of course, we try to theoretically follow our Constitution, which is several hundred years old,
Right.
but it's hard to take a document that's written 500 years before and have it apply perfectly to a different world. So they had a little bit of a challenge in figuring out.
Interesting. Um, I would be interested in kind of reading a book set in this time, sort of about this. I mean, even though it seems kind of dry, like maybe it would be kind of interesting to see, like maybe there are some monasteries that push back and don't want to do it, and I don't
I
know.
for sure remember in a couple of episodes ago, at least when Dunstan first started his reforms, a lot of the people that were living in monasteries were pissed off because they were nobles who were enjoying being married and getting drunk and doing whatever they wanted. And these reforms were quite strict. So,
I think that's one thing that's cool about this like early medieval period is it's this like transition between they were in like the 200s, it was Roman influence mixed with their like native influence, and then by now we're like seeing like medieval society is like fully going, but it still has a lot of like carry-ons from the like Roman period. So let's see, there is a document called the Regularis Concordia, which was a landmark document that standardized monastic practice. I guess that's sort of related to what we were just saying, but that's when it came out. It was 970. And he didn't get crowned until 973, and he was at Bath. And it's they think he deliberately delayed it until he was 30, which is the canonical age for a priest. You can't be a priest until you're 30. And then that rite is still forms the basis of how they coronate kings in England to this day. So this was the first time they had like this giant ceremony of him being crowned in this way.
yeah, there's different theories on it. Some argue that the delay was a penance imposed by Dunstan because of him stealing the nun. So, I mean, maybe
Mm,
Dunstan didn't like it. Um, or, like you said, it could have just been deliberate because that was the traditional age for the priest and it had a lot of symbolism.
yeah,
Or it could just be that he didn't feel a huge need for it because there wasn't any competition for the role. But what's interesting is what happened at the ceremony. As you said, it set the standard that was followed by King Charles, last year,
right,
when he was coronated, or I guess it was in 2023. How time flies.
right, yeah.
And also his wife, and at this point it's his third wife, was anointed alongside him, and she became the very first English queen consort to have an anointing coronation. So that made her a queen in a because remember in England or in all of Western Europe at this point, they were thinking that once you're anointed as the royal, like
Mhm.
maybe even your blood changes,
Mhm.
something special happens and gives you like maybe even the power to heal people and things like this. It only happens with the coronation. And so now, because the queen was coronated, had a coronation, she also had those powers.
Interesting. I mean, it
But
definitely
oh,
seems like a pretty good moment for women, just based on like Ethel, Elf Gifu. I don't know, all the older women that are kind of behind the scenes at this point. But did you want to talk about his other wives right now while we're on the topic?
sure. But and then we'll come back to this boat rowing thing.
Hmm.
So he had three wives, or potentially he didn't marry them all. It's really unknown if he married the first two or not. But we were wrong a minute ago when I said that when he kidnapped that nun, that was his first wife. That was actually the second woman, because the the first consort is the one that he had his eldest son with, who became Edward the Martyr, who we'll hear about presumably next week. And we don't really know anything about her. But again, some people think she was a nun that was seduced by Edgar, but other later chroniclers reject that and say she was, a noble woman or whatever. So that was wife one, or maybe not, the mother of his first and oldest
His
son.
baby mama.
Right. And then he had his second wife, or consort, and with her he had a daughter, Edith. And she may also have been a nun. And for sure,
What a
after
type.
a very short time being with Edgar, she took her daughter Edith and moved back to the monastery. Now, whether that's because Edgar sent her there because he was tired of her, or if she
Hmm.
like escaped there because she was
He
afraid
didn't.
of him,
Yeah.
unclear. But she went back since they weren't together that long. And so Edith kind of grew up with her mom in this monastery and later became a saint. And for many, many years, in fact, even today, some people have a celebrated feast day for her, Saint Edith, and people were doing pilgrimages to her. So,
Why was she a saint though? What exactly did she do?
well, I think she was just really kind of like we had talked about before, that she was really caring about the poor and the underprivileged and
Okay.
always doing things for them. But let me see. So she was both a princess and a nun. She had a really good education, and she was very interested in art, poetry, literature, and history. And she had a keen interest in fashion and was known for her fine clothing. And she founded a church. And actually, Dunstan attended the consecration of this church that she founded. And he noticed how she crossed herself, how the Catholics cross themselves. And he took a hold of her hand and held onto her thumb. And he said, "Never shall this thumb decay." And turns out, supposedly, after she died and they and took her out of her coffin years later, her thumb was still looking good as new
That's cool. I like stuff like
because of
that.
Dunstan. But she supported a hospital for the poor that cared for
Right.
lepers and outcasts. She gave bread, alms, and shelter. So I think she just did a lot of nice
That's one
things.
thing we can be grateful for is that leprosy is much less common now. So wait, that's Edith, but when I look at his spouses, it looks like it says Ethelflaed, Wulfrith, and then Elfrith.
Yeah, Wilfred was Edith's mom. Edith's is a daughter.
Oh, okay, so he wasn't married to Edith. I see. Okay.
No, 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 that was his daughter.
Okay.
And then his third wife is the one that was the queen that
Elfrith.
was at his coronation. What was her name again? It starts with an A.
Alf. Alfthrith, which is really hard to
Okay,
say.
and
A E.
she's
Never mind.
pretty interesting because So she had two sons with Edgar. Actually, did she have two? She had at least one. Um, Athel, Ethel, Ethelred, Ethelred the Unready.
Hmm.
And I can't
Foreshadowing.
wait to get to him because of his second wife, Queen Emma, that is the great niece of William the Conqueror. But so yeah, so she had Ethelred the Unready, and we'll find arguably later she may have had something to do with making her son king. Yeah, so
Okay.
she was an
Man, when we
interesting
do
lady
the King William episode, we might have to do like two parts. That's gonna be.
for sure.
All right. Was there anything else? Well, you wanted to say about wives, daughters, and then you wanted to say something about a boat.
Yeah,
And then
I
I had
don't have much else to say about the wives and daughters that we haven't already said. But let me
because
just
just
make
for listeners,
sure.
I feel like I haven't reiterated this, but like kind of I think a goal for this podcast is to not just talk about the kings, like they're kind of the central point of how we organize the episodes, but then also talk about the king,
The
queens,
women
and
who so often get ignored. Yeah. So I can't find it in my notes right now, so I'll have to go this from memory. But what I read and heard somewhere was that once he finally did go to his coronation, and I think it was on the way to the coronation, but it might have been just after, but I think it was on the way there. He had 12 under kings, including the King of Scotland, the King of Wales, all these other, like, kind of
oh, I
smaller
did read
things.
this. Yeah,
He got in a boat and had these 12 sub kings row him across to kind
the
of
River
show
Dee.
that he was the most powerful, right?
Right. No, it makes sense that back, I mean, even today we have ceremonies, but it sort of makes sense that you're doing this thing that people can physically see happening. You don't have to know how to read, you don't have to even be able to hear someone talk. It's like, okay, I can see they sailed the boats, like he must be, in charge of us because I know what this means.
That's a really good point. As you said, people had to get their education, most people, through like looking at the stained glass windows at the church and the stories that those told and things like that. So yeah, that's a really good point. The symbolism of the people that were lining the banks of the river for this important day to be able to see their king being clearly the most powerful, especially after all these years. They had heard story after story and maybe even lived through all this fighting amongst the different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Norse. So
I know we've only covered like about 100 years, I feel like, and all we were on episode like 7, and so it's still, yeah, we're not that far away from when Alfred the Great was king. He barely had any of England. It was basically a Viking island. And also, I think because they had just had sort of the split of the kingdom, I bet it was like they were just trying to like sort of shore up the legitimacy as much as possible. Like, okay, this guy's in charge, he controls everything. Um, we're reestablishing our
yeah,
power. And
I
it
think
says
King
that
Edgar. I'm sorry. I think that King Edgar is King Alfred's great grandson, right?
I've lost track. I know he's Edmund's son, and then
And
Edmund was
Edmund
the
is the
son of
son of Edward, I believe.
Edward, who is the son of Alfred, yeah. So it seems like Edgar, like a lot of these past kings, has been doing decent amount of law creation, legal, uh, you know, work, but it seemed like he was more about the administration of the law than he wasn't so focused on making all these new laws. It was like he was just making sure it was actually being administered, so properly enforced. So I would assume that sort of means sending out more soldiers or whoever's patrolling and making sure that trials are happening. I don't know. I honestly don't know if they were having that many trials or just more like hanging people, but uh, I'm assuming it's just that that's something you do when you feel like things are getting a little bit out of control and you want to like sort of scare people straight to.
Hmm.
following the laws.
Right. And he wasn't king for that long. How many years was it? He,
Only
I mean, he started super
for
young. At,
16, so not too short, but pretty short.
okay. But still,
Um,
he died young, right? Because if he became king at 14 of Mercia,
yeah, so he was only like, yeah, he was 32. I was actually wondering if I hadn't seen anything about, so he dies July 8th, 975 at age 32. But it doesn't really say how, because that seems still pretty young. I thought even for this time, so it's just sort of
yeah, I didn't
no.
hear how either, but I will say that this marks the end of our getting to talk about Edgifu.
Okay.
Remember, she was Edward's wife, Edward's third wife,
Hmm.
and she was then, we think she made the deal with King Athelstan to raise her children so that they would be king after Athelstan rather than the competing sons of Edward from his other wives. And they did. And so when her sons were kings, she was a powerful queen mother, especially as they were younger. And then,
Hmm.
as we've seen these last two episodes, as a grandmother. So,
Yeah.
unfortunately, though, at this
Yeah.
point, she's going to hit the dust.
And then, interestingly enough, we'll soon get to Ethelred the Unready, who doesn't have her to use as an
He
advisor.
needed her
He
guidance,
needed her
right?
guidance. Yeah. So
And
yeah. Mhm.
we'll talk about it during that episode, but he was called, even though he seems like that nickname would be because he was not ready to be
Mhm.
king, he was not ready for anything. It was really meant that his advisors were, he was not
Poorly
well
advised.
advised. Yeah.
Because that's still a thing that even during the Revolutionary War in America, at the very beginning, they didn't even push the idea of, oh, like we don't like kings, we don't want to have kings, we're a democracy, all this sort of thing. It was more the parliament in England has too much power and the poor king can't, do the things that he wants to do and he's getting taken advantage of. So I think that's in my mind where that's coming from of like, oh, Ethelred didn't do a horrible job. He was just poorly advised. But yeah, Edgar posthumously, so not until the year 1000, 25 years later, he is venerated as a saint, and his tomb at Glastonbury Abbey becomes a pilgrimage site. And he, is still known as Edgar the Peaceful, and he's a saint. Pretty interesting. I don't think there are that many kings that were sainted.
I just saw before we sign off my notes about um, Elfthrith, his third wife.
Hmm.
Um, they say Edgar sent his noblemen to assess whether this man, this elderman's daughter, was beautiful enough to be queen.
Hmm.
And the guy he sent, named Ethelwald, was so impressed by the woman that he married her himself and sent back word, oh, no, 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 she's not worthy for you. He married
Wow.
her. And then
Big
Edgar
fly.
found out the truth. And this, we don't know if this is true or not, but this is the rumor that was. Edgar found out the truth and arranged for a royal hunting party. And during the hunt, somehow Ethelwald was killed. And he
Hmm.
was stabbed with a spear. And guess what? Edgar then married the widow, who was this woman that became his third wife. So,
Yeah. Wow. It's you can't trust your own family. Even back then, it's sad.
and this won't be the first person we'll hear about that is killed during a hunt under
Right.
suspicious
That's
circumstances.
very true. That even happens in Game of Thrones. Um, so yeah, before we sign off, I did have some sort of like fun facts I wanted to run through. It was just that um, I found something I was just curious about, like the difference between the different like municipalities. I don't know what you would call it, like the difference between shires, hundreds, wapentakes, and burrs. So a shire is the largest administrative region, which is sort of like a modern county. And yeah, they each shire was typically overseen by an alderman or a sheriff, which is like shire reeve, and they're like the king's representative. And then hundreds were smaller subdivisions within a shire, more for like local policing and like local like courts and tax collection. So a hundred was mainly in the southern and western parts of England, so the more like traditionally like British part rather than the kind of Viking part. And a hundred represented an area of land sufficient to support 100 households, so that makes sense. And then I don't know how to pronounce this, but wapentakes are used in the Danelaw, so like northern and eastern England, and it comes from an Old Norse term vapnatak, which refers to the taking or clashing of weapons to signal agreement at a local assembly. So it's just yeah, where you hit your swords together and show that you're agreeing. And anyway, that. And
Sounds
then a
like you're
bird,
not agreeing when you're hitting
right?
swords together.
Well, you're not using the swords to hit each other, I guess. But yeah, that sounds pretty violent, very Viking thing to do. And then the last one was the burr, which we heard about. King, man, I cannot remember which king invented the concept of burrs. It might have been Alfred or Edward, one of
I
those, I
think it
think.
was Alfred. Hmm.
And yeah, oh yeah,
Remember,
sorry,
I
it
think
says
the
right
birds
here.
were set up so that he would have the ability, and they were set up close enough so that he would have ability for one to communicate with another so they could
Right.
know, okay, the Norsemen are coming.
Yeah, it was Alfred and then expanded by Edward. I forgot I wrote that, but yeah, I always think that's interesting the concept of like a watchtower where you can see all they have to do is light their fire, and then as long as you can see their watchtower from far away, you can light your fire, and then it can keep going down.
Right, which reminds me of they did that when the volcano erupted for Pompeii.
Oh,
They they alerted, I think Herculaneum and the town, forgotten his name. They were
what?
kind of a famous guy. Um,
Okay.
so yeah, that they were doing it even back then during the Pompeii times.
Yeah, I think that's what's so interesting about the past, like especially yeah, like ancient Rome and sort of like medieval England is they had so much less technology than we do now, but they got creative with ways like you could use like hawks to send messages, and it's just really cool how you can if you don't need electricity for to do as much as we do now. It just makes it easier. So anyway, I also thought this was a fun fact. Not really that fun, but interesting. So there was this bishop named Oda who died in 958, who had been the Archbishop of Canterbury, and so he dies, and then his replacement was supposed to be Elfsieg, but he froze to death in the Alps on the way to get his
Whoa,
pallium from the Pope. So how
yikes.
he got sent down to go to the Pope, and he freezes in the Alps, which is wild. And then Bar Barlthelm, Bishop of Wells, was Edwig's second choice. But then, sorry, that was Edwig did this. I misread that, but Edwig had done this. But then
Oh
when
yeah, because Edward
Edward,
couldn't stand Dunstan.
and then when Edgar succeeded and became king, he dismissed Berlthelm on the ground that he was too gentle to maintain discipline and appointed Dunstan. But I would think he more just Dunstan made him do that, is my guess.
Right, my guess too.
Oh, let's see.
It's
It
also kind
says
of interesting for him to say this guy was too gentle when
known as
Edgar
the
has
peaceful.
this nickname of the peaceful.
Hmm. I
He
really
definitely
don't think he
wasn't
was
a gentle
peaceful.
person.
Yeah,
No.
especially when it's saying that he cared more about enforcing the law. That makes it seem
Yeah,
like
yeah,
he was
yeah.
really strict. And
He was very strict at enforcing the law and made sure
yeah,
that people under him enforced it strictly. He seemed like
and
kind
then
of an asshole.
yeah, I don't think he was probably the nicest. Even yeah. So then it says that he also, rather than fighting the Vikings, he just sort of was more diplomatic with them. So it was almost like he was strict with his own people, but he didn't want to necessarily cause a war with the Vikings. And it said he had a big fleet that would patrol the coast. So it says that he had up to 4,000 ships that would sail around
Wow.
Britain each summer, projecting power and deterring invasion without a single battle being fought. So maybe when we get to like Ethelred or something, maybe he kind of stops doing that. Or, well, I know he then gets sort of distracted with the other Viking that comes and attacks, so that's why he kind of loses to William. But we'll get to that. Um, and apparently, he was obsessed with standardized weights and measures, which seems pretty important. If everyone's using a different measurement, it's hard
Right.
to build things. And then I don't want to say what happens to his son, but something will happen to his son that's unfortunate. And then he might have been styled Emperor of Britain. There are some charters that refer to him as Basilius, which is Greek for emperor, and ruler of all Britain, suggesting Edgar and his court were deliberately cultivating an imperial image far beyond a simple king of England.
Another thing that Napoleon, I guess,
Hmm.
took from Edgar because, of course, he became emperor as well. So,
Well, I don't know if he took it from Edgar. I think he probably took it from like Caesar or
well, I
whatever.
wanted to say it's like Napoleon, but obviously Edgar was many
Much
years before
earlier.
Napoleon. So,
Quite a bit earlier. Well, maybe after we finish all the English kings, we can do the French kings.
I think that would be good. My French teacher asked me if we were going to do that.
I think that would make sense. And then we can do like German kings or something. All right. Well, Edgar, actually, for someone that only ruled like 16 years, and for part of that time it was half the kingdom, he did quite a bit and lived an interesting life. I wish we knew how he died, but probably just some disease.
Maybe
And
his third wife secretly poisoned him.
and we only really have, I think, two more Anglo-Saxon kings ever to talk about.
Athelstan the Unready.
Well,
Yep.
no, I think
And
we'll
then
do
Edward
Edgar.
the Confessor.
Right, but I think we flip. I think it's Edward the Martyr, then Ethelred the
Oh, I see what you're
Unready.
saying. Yeah.
Right. So, hope you've
I
enjoyed
mean,
the
but
English.
arguably Edward the Confessor because he was Athelstan the Unready's son.
Okay, so maybe three more. So we've still had time. All right. Well,
Okay, good to
this
see
has
you.
been the Rain Check podcast. We still don't have a sign off. Um, so we'll see you next time.
Sounds good.
Bye.
Bye.